Greetings, welcome to the show. This is The Overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to talk about reparations and the need for reparations and what reparations are basically. You know, ever since 2020, after the George Floyd incident, there has been a resurgence in the talk about reparations. It died down after a while, but during that period, there's more of a talk of reparations for the damages of slavery and colonialism. So I'm going to take a look at the issue today because, you know, reparations, as I'll mention later on, doesn't just look at the African American or the African community. It covers all peoples that have been exploited and colonized and mistreated by the Europeans in particular. So even although reparations in this program won't be mentioning actually one of the major contributors of exploitation and mistreatment of African people, that is the Arab world. And Arab slavery, I think, doesn't continue so much today, even though some might argue that it's still there. But it's another aspect where we can look at where reparations should be paid, even though the fruits of this Arab exploitation is not seen, the results I should say, is not seen so much. Although you do have some African or black communities in certain areas of the Arab world, it's not as well known as in the Americas or the Caribbean or wherever else Africans were exploited or taken to. So anyway, what are reparations? The word reparations is seen in the Merriam-Webster dictionary as repairing or keeping in repair, the act of making amends, offering expiation, or giving satisfaction for a wrong or injury, something done or given as amends or satisfaction. So that's a brief look at the meaning of reparations. Anyway, looking at the, this is from the CARICOM website. Ever since slavery was abolished in the Caribbean in the 1830s and in the broader Americas in the 1860s and the 1880s, the victims of slavery and their progeny have been struggling for justice to repair the damages wrought by this horrific of crimes against humanity. Saying here that the struggle has ebbed and flowed over the decades of the 19th and 20th centuries. Reparations have been a part and parcel of other liberation movements over the years, i.e. the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist and pan-Africanist civil rights, human rights movements in the Caribbean, North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean, especially during the decades from the 1930s to the 1990s. So that's a brief background of the reparations struggle over the years. And in terms of certain aspects of what our reparations should be paid, one of the issues or the points that they could mention is personal injury. An enslaved African in the British West Indies was chattel, the official slave codes in Barbados in 1661. Institutionalized the dehumanization of black people as property. Under these laws, Africans were gibbeted, castrated, branded with hot irons, dismembered and locked in dungeons for unlimited periods of time as forms of punishment. So this idea that personal injury, even in terms of compensation today, there are legal issues around that, that particular point. So personal injury as part of the slavery process should also be considered something that can be compensated for. That is what they're arguing. In the US, the history of reparations as a system of redress for egregious injustices are not foreign to the US. So there are mentioned several communities here which have been compensated, even though not enough, by the United States. Native Americans have received land and billions of dollars for various benefits and programs for the forcibly exiled from their native lands. The Japanese received 1.5 billion. This was paid for those who were interned during World War II. The US itself, via the Marshall Plan, helped to ensure that the Jews received reparations for the Holocaust. And then in 1952, the West Germany agreed to pay 3.45 billion Deutschmarks to Holocaust survivors. So those are forms of reparations that have been paid in recent years to certain groups, but not African Americans or Africans or people from the Caribbean. And this is regarding some people might know about this 40 acres that was supposed to be given to African Americans after slavery, or a certain amount of African Americans. And this details that process and what actually happened to those 40 acres. You've always heard stories about people not given their 40 acres, and this explains why. This is from the Britannica.com. On January 16, 1865, Sherman issued Special Field Order number 15 that authorized 400,000 acres of coastal land from Charleston, South Carolina, to the St. Johns River in Florida to be divided into 40-acre plots and given to newly freed enslaved people for their exclusive use. The land had been confiscated by the Union from white slaveholders during the Civil War. Because Sherman later gave orders for the army to lend mules to the freedmen, the phrase 40 acres and a mule became popular. But however, as I'll continue to read, however, shortly after Vice President Andrew Johnson became president following Abraham Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, he worked to rescind the order and revert the land back to the white landowners. So this 40 acres that African Americans were supposed to be given, when a new president came to power, basically he removed that order, he reversed that order. So the land was given back to the whites. So it's as if some effort was made by one president to institute some kind of reparations to the African Americans, but the following president decided no, he didn't want this to happen, so he gave the order to reverse that principle or that order. It's like today where you have these current US presidents, one brings in a resolution or a new law, for example, tariffs against a particular country. Then when the next president comes in after the next 4 years, he reverses it, or they can reverse an agreement made, international agreement made with a particular country. Or the one, for example, the nuclear agreement made with Iran, which included several countries, including the UK, Russia, France, several countries, and the US. The US pulled out of the agreement when Trump came to power. Although Biden, when he came back into power, didn't go back into it. But there are certain agreements like the climate agreement that the US pulled out of when Trump came to power. When Biden came to power, they went back into it, and now they're pulled out of it again. So this idea that states can keep joining and leaving agreements based on the whims of a particular president is not good for international cooperation. And it's the same thing they did here with the slavery reparations order. One president said, yes, we'll allow this order or compensation to African Americans, and the other one comes in and decides he no longer agrees. So you could argue it depends on the level of racism in this stage, in this instance, that a particular president, one who's more racist than the other, can come in and change certain laws because of his perception of what's happening in society. Whereas another one will come in and change it. So the leadership of a country, in a sense, can depend on the whims of a particular president. But then again, if you look at the US, you know, they have their hidden rulers of the society, because the president is not the final ruler of the country or leader of the country, or the one who says which direction the country is going in. he has a certain leeway, but he has to still fit within a framework of what their agenda is. Anyway, moving on. I'm looking at two of the organizations that are involved in this reparations issue, one in the Caribbean and one in the US. Both of them have their plans about to go about seeking reparations. So this one is for the CARICOM, the Caribbean Reparations Commission. CARICOM stands for Caribbean Community. It's like the European Union or the African Union for the Caribbean. In 2013, Caribbean heads of governments established the CARICOM Reparations Commission with a mandate to prepare the case for reparatory justice for the region's indigenous and African descendant communities who are the victims of crimes against humanity in the forms of genocide, slavery, slave trading, and racial apartheid. So this document prepared by the CRC proposes the delivery of this mandate within the formulation of the CARICOM Reparations Justice Program. The CRC asserts that victims and descendants of these crimes against humanity have a legal right to reparatory justice, and that those who committed these crimes and who have been enriched by these proceeds of these crimes have a reparatory case to answer. Basically, they have to repay something for what they have earned or gained through the process of enslaving and exploiting people, I should say. And this one is about the establishment of the National African American Reparations Commission. So this is the US version of the commission. Established in April 2015, the NAARC is a group of distinguished professionals from across the country with outstanding accomplishments in the fields of law, medicine, journalism, academia, history, civil rights, and social justice. They are united in a common commitment to fight for reparatory justice, compensation, and restoration of the African American communities that were plundered by the historical crimes of slavery, segregation, and colonialism, and that continue to be victims or victimized by the legacies of slavery and American apartheid. Anyway, that's an explanation of the NAARC. And the CARICOM Reparations Commission, they have several points here of what the Europeans have done and the issues that need to be tackled. This is not the 10-point plan, these are just some issues which they look at as points which need to be handled or looked at or examined as to what the Europeans have done and where compensation can come in. So the European governments were owners, traders of enslaved Africans, instructed genocidal actions upon the indigenous communities. 2, created legal, financial, and fiscal policies necessary for the enslavement of Africans, and then defined and enforced African enslavement, native genocide as in their national interests. So they perceive that it's their national interest to plunder, pillage, and genocide and the native peoples of a land that they want to take over. So in the stages of creating a nation, they want to go into a land and kill off all the people so they can take the land. And that is what they perceive as national interest. Anyway, continue. Refused compensation to the enslaved with the ending of their enslavement. Compensated slave owners, that one I'll detail more later on. Compensated slave owners at emancipation for the loss of legal property rights and in enslaved Africans. Imposed a further 100 years of racial apartheid upon the emancipated. And the last 2, imposed for another 100 years policies designed to perpetuate suffering upon the emancipated and survivors of genocide. And lastly, and have refused to acknowledge such crimes or to compensate victims and their descendants. Even up to today, the British government doesn't want to compensate. It acknowledges that some wrong was done, but it doesn't see the need to compensate because they said it's too far in the past. I'll give an example in a while of one British family that benefited and continues to benefit from the slave trade. and the use of enslaved peoples. This one is from the NAACP. This is an African American organization. I've forgotten the name. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. That is the NAACP. This is a short statement on reparations and slavery itself. African Americans have been enslaved in the United States from 1916 to 1865, and people of African descent have been murdered, brutalized, made victims of genocide, sexually assaulted, and economically depressed based on race in the United States from 1619 through to the Civil Rights Movement, even up to today. So it's beyond the Civil Rights Movement. Evidence of this systemic racism are still present today. The United States government must atone for their actions in the name of the United States government against black people in the United States. So that's a statement. It's a longer statement, but I just mentioned a section of the statement by the NAACP. Although this organization is dubious because some of its funding comes from the Jewish community, so at the beginning of the organization, Jewish people were very much involved in forming the organization. So anyway, let's move on. These are 10-point plans of both the CARICOM and the African American version, or the American Commission. First point, number 1, both are the same, a formal apology. But in America, it talks about a formal apology and the establishment of a Mahafa, African Holocaust Institute. The CARICOM just mentions a formal apology. Point number 2 is, for the American version, it's a right of repatriation and creation of an African knowledge program. Point number 2 for the Caribbean is an indigenous peoples development program. Point number 3 for the Caribbean is about a repatriation program, or funding for a repatriation program. And NRC, the right to land for social and economic development, that's in the US. In the Caribbean, it doesn't mention issues of land in the Caribbean itself, but it does mention the establishment of cultural institutions, the return of cultural heritage. And number 4, for the American version, funds for cooperative enterprise and socially responsible entrepreneurial development. That is a business development, and any kind of business initiative that African Americans want to start, there should be some kind of funding for that. And then also they'll talk about public health and remedying the health damages that were caused by the colonial process, by the slavery process, and the apartheid process, particularly in the US. Mentions health, wellness, healing of black families and their communities, and education for community development. So both, number 6 for both of them basically is the same. Number 7, enhancement of historical and cultural knowledge systems, or knowledge. That's basically people traveling from Africa, between Africa and the continent, and the African continent, and gaining some kind of cultural exchange, so people can go back to the continent and re-experience how their ancestors lived. In America, basically, they're talking about housing for healthy black communities and wealth generation. Then continuing, strengthening Black America's information and communications infrastructure. That one's an important aspect in terms of communication between the communities. In the Caribbean, psychological rehabilitation as a result of the transmission of trauma. So the psychological trauma that has affected the black communities in the diaspora. Because if you look at the African American and Caribbean communities, their level of development, or their attitude towards development when they travel to, for example, the African American community is not doing as well as the Africans that are coming from the continent recently, because of the trauma that they've experienced in being the European dominant environment, they seem to integrate less than the Africans that are coming from the continent, who want to strive more within a European setting than those who have been through the slavery process. And continued, obviously, debt cancellation for Caribbean communities, and then the right to development through use of technology. And in America, repairing the damages of the criminal injustice system. So there are certain aspects which are particular to their particular region, like in America, the criminal justice systems and African Americans being arrested and treated and killed by police, for example, and treated differently by the judicial system. It's not the same in the Caribbean though, so they haven't mentioned it in their 10-point plan. So let's look at the 10-point plans for both groups. I'm going to look at this, what they call is that a report? Well, first of all, let me look at this section here. I'm going to mention now this issue of, the slave owners were given compensation when slavery ended. The British slave owners were given compensation when slavery was ended. And this was in 1883. So this is a University of London article where a small quotation from. The British government borrowed 20 million in 1883 to compensate slave owners, which amounted to a massive 40% of the Treasury's annual income at the time. That was about 5% of British GDP at the time. According to the Treasury, the loan was only finally paid off in 2015. Really? So the wealth created by slave trade and plantation continues to shape British society to this day. In some cases, remains in the hands of families whose ancestors were involved in buying and selling slaves, running enterprises based on slave labor. One example is the Drax family of the Charborough estate in Dorset, which is now owned by Conservative MP Richard Drax. This is one of the families that I said I was going to mention, who was involved in slavery, and they're still benefiting up to today. So let me continue here. Really? Okay. Yeah, I believe I mentioned this one. The wealth created by the slave trade and plantation continues to, yeah, I've read it. Okay, that's the Drax family. I'm just trying to find the part that I'm looking for. Their ancestor, James Drax, who lived between 1609 and 1662, was one of the first settlers in Barbados in 1627, and is credited with inventing the British sugar industry in the 1630s. Around 1640, he developed the integrated sugar plantation. So this James Drax was the first, or one of the first planters in the British Empire to move a workforce of enslaved Africans where the children of slaves were held in perpetuity. That means that their children continued to be slaves throughout their life. His descendant, the Conservative MP for South Dorset, Richard Grosvenor Plunkett Emil Earl Drax, heads the family that owns the vast Charborough estate and the Drax Oil Plantation in Barbados. You know what these slaveholders did when they made their profits in the Caribbean? They built great, huge mansions back in the UK. They also invested in certain industries. For example, the steam engine, James Watt steam engine, its development was funded by one of these slaveholders. Anyway, more recently, Maya Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, met with the Drax family, and he was offered two options. One, a package of reparations including oil or a substantial part of Drax oil. If he refused, Mia Motley said they could take legal action over the issue. So other families such as the Trevelyan's, the Gladstones, and the Heirs of Slavery group have come to represent those who recognize their family wealth came from and feel the need to apologize and make some kind of reparations. I know certain universities in the UK have given scholarships to people from the Caribbean as a form of reparations, but the government itself hasn't recognized its need to do something to repair the damage caused by the slave trade and the process of slavery itself. So that's a look at one example of somebody who's become wealthy, whose family has become wealthy through slavery, holding people as slaves and using them as cheap labor to make their own wealth. So anyway, I'm looking at some statistics now around the kind of payments that should be paid and the amounts of payments that should be paid in reference to reparations. The Brattle report estimated that the UK, which was the biggest slave trading nation up to 1807 and did not abolish slave ownership in the empire until 1834, should pay reparations up to amounts of 18.5 trillion. And to put that into context, the estimated annual GDP for the UK for 2023 is around 2.5 trillion. And the entire worth of the UK, its land, infrastructure and everything in it, was estimated by the Office for National Statistics at 10 trillion. So what they owe is what is worth more than the UK itself. Almost twice what the UK, so whether they'll be able to pay it is dubious, but some form of payments or some form of reparations needs to be made. There are various areas, like one of the universities gave scholarship. There can be funds set up for economic investment by the Caribbean community, plus business training, all kind of educational training so that the communities or societies can progress. You know, in the UK in particular, and probably in the US, African Americans and black people in general were not able to get loans when others were able to get loans to start their businesses. So this is one of the systems they use to depress or suppress the growth of black communities in the Western world. Some of the facilities that were available to non-blacks in terms of loans and credit, for example, was not afforded to people who were formerly enslaved or their ancestors were enslaved. Anyway, the second one is from the Newsweek. It's a study in the review of the Black Political Economy Journal, first published on June 19th, titled Wealth Implications of Slavery and Racial Discrimination for African American Descendants of the Enslaved. It looked at the black and white wealth gap, and among its estimates for the costs were 12 to 13 trillion in 2018 dollars, based upon estimates looking at the land base stemming from the promise made to freed slaves and price-based, considering what slave prices were at the time. So this one's saying up to 13 trillion, the other one's saying, but then again, that's America, the US, the UK is actually saying more. And continuing, this is continuing with the Newsweek article. There's another estimate based on wealth disparity, which states around 14 trillion. And Robert Johnson, the founder of BET, Black Entertainment Television, suggests this sum would amount to around 350,000 each for the 40 million citizens of the US, well, African American citizens of the US. So another study of the University of Connecticut researcher Thomas Kramer, who was involved in the aforementioned study, published on June the 19th, that suggested an amount of 14.2 trillion. And this was tabulated by, they counted the number of hours slaves worked between 1776 and 1865, and they multiplied that by the average wage at the time. Then they came out with this figure of 14 trillion. That's what they families would be, the overall figure, individuals, as the other person said, would be given at around 350,000 each. You know, it's nice to talk about figures, but in reality, they can't pay that amount of money, 14 trillion. So some effort would have to be made in some way, but these statistics are just giving an overall view of what really should be owed, even though they'll probably never see that amount, but it's just indicating that something needs to be done on a relatively high scale to compensate people for the damage of what slavery has enforced on their lifestyle up to today. Anyway, I think I've finished there. There are some others. This one relates to California between 1950 and 1920, the racism and incarceration that they have suffered in that particular region of the US. They calculated some form of reparations for that type of damage. It was calculated by the California Reparations Task Force. Recommends the state consider down payments to eligible African American residents of a certain amount, and this amounts to 1.38 million each for the residents of California. That's over what, 70-year period. In terms of health harms, mass incarceration or over-policing, housing discrimination, devaluation of businesses, unjust property takings. So each person would be given 1 million. It sounds a lot of money, but in today's terms, it's not that much really. But anyway, that's a look at reparations and the idea of repayment to people for what has been, damages has been caused to the communities, the black communities, particularly in the Caribbean and the Americas. But I've not mentioned the African continent itself in terms of reparations for colonialism. And I think that, should I read through this last one? This is looking at the US again. Today, the average white family has roughly 10 times the amount of wealth as the average black family. White college graduates have over 7 times more wealth than black college graduates. I'm looking at basically at the African American communities in the US. The Africans that have traveled more recently, their wealth may be greater than the African American communities, but the focus of their communities is different. You find a lot of Africans coming from the continent, they've been students already in their own countries, or they've come here to come to the US to study. So they have a certain level of education already, or it's built into how they arrive in the US. So their opportunities are going to be higher, rather than the African Americans who have gone through slavery, Jim Crow, and their psychological damage has caused them not to want to contribute to American society the same way the Africans who are fresh off the boat, you could say, with some level of education or seeking education. And they have they perceive the Europeans differently, basically. They don't see the Europeans the same way, or the whites the same way the African Americans do, or people who have been through a process of sees them. So they're more naive and more eager to get on and live in Western society without realizing the full understanding of how those societies were formed and how they've treated. Well, some of them, when they arrive, they realize the treatment that black people face, but even though they may not fully understand why, but it doesn't change them from wanting to be part of a society which you could argue will still perceive them as different, and that racist mindset will still be there, but they're willing to tolerate it, primarily because their understanding of it, I don't think, is the same as those who have been through it long term. Anyway, that's a look at the issue of reparations and how much should be paid. I haven't considered whether they'll actually pay it. That's another debate. But this just looks at who is considering it, the two organizations that are covering it, and the different aspects that they're looking at, and the amounts that should be paid. Anyway, that's it for now.